Hey, before we get started, I got a new headset. I was wondering, can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's get started. Today we'll be covering clustering. This is our first unsupervised learning method. Everybody can hear me okay? Okay. So what is unsupervised learning? Well, first we'll talk about like supervised versus unsupervised learning. Well, you remember surely that in supervised learning, we learn some kind of function that maps an input X to an output or label Y based on example and input-output data. So we have input data and input labels. And then we do things like training test splits and so on to evaluate that stuff. And we had two different methods for supervised, or two different approaches to supervised learning. The first one was regression, where we tried to take a feature vector X and predict a real number Y. And in classification, we had a feature vector X and tried to predict a discrete or categorical variable Y. Things like, did they survive or die, or what kind of species of plant is it, based on the input data. And so that kind of like taking a data vector and a label, a ground truth label, is what makes it supervised, right? That's the supervision. We have like ground truth that we can use to learn something. However, very often we don't have these labels, and getting labels is actually fairly tricky, right? So like, how do you acquire a label for image classification, right? And so what the way that people do this is like they give lots of people tasks to label an image. But as you can imagine, that is complicated, and that is not always possible. Unsupervised learning, in contrast to supervised learning, tries to learn hidden structure from unlabeled data. So unsupervised methods are frequently used to identify a previously unknown structure of the dataset. A couple of unsupervised learning methods and tasks include clustering, which we'll be covering today and in an immediate future lecture. Then dimensionality reduction, we will cover that in, I think, a week or two. Then density estimation, then anomaly detection, and so on. So all of these, they kind of like are supposed to work without labels. Unsupervised learning can also be very useful precursor to data visualization. For example, if I have a very high dimensional data set, I could use dimensionality reduction to visualize it. Or I could use clustering to optimize my visualization, for example, a heat map or something like that. And so those are like very important pieces. In general, I do think of supervised versus unsupervised methods also. I'm using supervised when I want to build some kind of like data product to predict something, and I'm using unsupervised when I, as a human, as an analyst, as a researcher, want to like understand my data. Okay, so today we'll be covering clustering, and clustering is the task of discovering unknown subgroups in the data. We call them clusters. You can also think of clustering as a way of grouping. We want to partition the data set into clusters where similar items are in the same cluster and dissimilar items are in different clusters. For example, in a social network, you can use clustering to find communities, like who are tightly connected friendships or family circles. In ecology, you could cluster organisms that share attributes into species, genus, and so on. You could apply clustering to something like our handwritten digits example if we don't have the label. So generally, I also can use these data sets that we've used for supervised learning. I can also use them for clustering. I just like don't use the labels, or I only use the labels for evaluation. And we'll talk at the end of the lecture how we can do that. Very common is the use of cluster in the biomedical field. So for example, if you want to discover disease subtypes based on clinical or lab data, you would run a clustering algorithm. I did like a big project on analyzing TCGA, cancer genome data with clustering approaches, so that we could help people discover subtypes of, for example, like brain cancer and so on. And so clustering is used in all of these applications when you don't have like known labels. So just to make sure that everybody got that, can somebody kind of explain to me now what the difference between clustering and classification is?
I would say that clustering would be where there's not like a certain set of classifications that it could be basically partitioned into, that it would be more like an open-ended for instance, when OpenAI was playing the video game, you would think that would be something along the lines of clustering, because there's not actually like set outcomes to the data.
I don't know about that example, but I think you got the gist right. Yeah. So the difference is classification is we have known labels and we have labels to train our data set. In clustering, we don't have known labels. We want to group items. We can say those items belong together, but we actually can't necessarily label them meaningfully, right? So a human would have to go in and label them meaningfully. But we don't have any labeled data. That's the big difference here. And there are a couple of challenges to clustering. So first, we must make sense of what it means for two items in a data set to be similar to one another. So we need these similar metrics or similarity functions. And there's a couple of different choices, and I'm not going to cover them today, but we'll be covering them in the second clustering lecture. But there's many choices: Euclidean distance, person correlation, Manhattan distance, weighted distances, Jaccard coefficients, and so on. And there's like some that are good for numerical data, some that are good for categorical data, and there's like for different situations and for different cases, some the different metrics are useful. And since the data is unlabeled, we don't have ground truths, so we have no accuracy score, right? So evaluating a cluster or clustering based on like completely unlabeled data is tricky. Usually, what we do is we visualize it and we try to make sense of whether that makes sense. Or I'll talk about a couple of methods like silhouette analysis and looking at intercluster distances and so on that we can use to evaluate clusterings. But it's also common, for example, to run like 10 different clusterings and then compare the results and pick the best result. So it is less of a like hard thing to do. It's more of like an exploratory analysis. And then usually like you try to like learn groups, understand groups, characterize these groups, and then describe them in some way. In terms of like what kinds of clustering methods are out there, we have like, I guess, like two big pieces here, like partitional algorithms and hierarchical algorithms. Partitional algorithms divide the data set into a set of bins. So we get out of it, we get for each data point, is it assigned to a bin 1, a bin 2, up to like whatever your number of clusters is. And for partitional algorithms, we either set bins manually. For example, the method that we'll be covering today, k-means, uses manually set k, or we can try to like automatically determine it. This is like the affinity propagation algorithm, for example, does automatically come up with a number of clusters. So partitional algorithms take an input set and divide it into discrete groups. Hierarchical algorithms, they produce a dendrogram or a similarity tree. And we'll be covering some hierarchical algorithms in the second clustering lecture. But the point here is that I don't have just like an assignment to certain groups, but we actually have a similarity tree. And then we can take that tree and cut it at a certain point and produce discrete groups. But we can do that very flexibly with minimal computational overhead. So for example, if you don't have any idea about like how many groups you would expect in a data set, maybe a hierarchical algorithm would be a good approach, because then you can dynamically also explore different binnings. And then orthogonal to these two different types of algorithms, there are also like bi-clustering and fuzzy clustering methods. Bi-clustering does cluster both dimensions and records at the same time. Sometimes that's something that you want. Mostly, like what we'll be doing is we have a table, right? Like our iris data set, we have columns, and then we have species, the individual items, and we will cluster these items into groups, for example. But sometimes you, like, let's suppose you have like a very long list of dimensions, all human genes, and a very long list of items, expression values for every single person in a big study. Then you also want to group the genes into some kind of like, maybe ideally you want to see functional groups, but you also want to group the people, so you can cluster both the dimensions and the items at the same time. And then finally, fuzzy clustering, like as we've seen in supervised learning already, it's not always that easy that we can assign something to a label. Like think about the movie reviews, right? We had some movie reviews that were somewhere in the middle, so saying one was great, the other one was bad, or like this one is great, or this is a positive review, this is a negative review, isn't always that easy. So we can do things like probabilistic assignment. We can say, well, we think that this particular item belongs with 70% probability to this cluster, and with 28% probability to this other cluster, and with 2% probability to the third cluster. So we don't have discrete assignments, we have probabilistic assignments. And that is sometimes very useful. We'll talk not too much about that, because it's also like fairly tricky to visualize, but it's actually like a smart way. It just makes the handling of the data downstream more complicated. And we have many variants of these ideas also implemented in scikit-learn. Here at this link, you can find an overview of all of these clustering methods. So you have k-means, affinity propagation, mean shift, and so on. And so we'll look at some of these over the next 2 lectures. Okay, so now let's talk about the most common, the most like widely known clustering method, which is called k-means clustering. And so the idea of k-means is that I have a collection of points, xi, for I is 1 to n, and x is a vector, some numerical vector. And in k-means cluster, we try to find k centers, mu L, where for L is 1 to k, and we try to assign each point x to a cluster CL with a center mu L, which minimizes the total intra-cluster distance. So the idea is that we have these centroids mu, and we assign like that correspond to a cluster, and we assign the points such that we minimize the distance between each point and its centroid. So that's the formal idea, and so we want to minimize this. And in practice, the way this is frequently implemented is with Lloyd's algorithm. And here we have like a set of points xi to xn, and an integer k given, which is our number of clusters. we pick k starting points, and then while it's not converged, we assign each point x to the cluster C with the closest center mu. And then we calculate the distance from this particular point xi to its centroid. And then we assign that point to the cluster CL with the smallest distance. And then we compute for each cluster a new center by taking the mean of all of the items assigned to the cluster. And I'm gonna this is like the formal definition. I'm gonna briefly sketch this on my iPad here. Okay. So everybody can see my iPad?
Yes.
Great. So let's suppose we have the data points here in 2 dimensions. The black dots are my data points. And then I want to assign them to 3 clusters. And I have kind of like indicated the first cluster centroids for the 3 clusters that I've picked at random with these x's. So we have a red x, a green x, and a blue x. And so the way this works now is that first we calculate, like for each point, we calculate a distance, like which is the closest point? Is it for this point, which is the closest centroid, right? Is it this one or is it this one? And we can see that, well, for this particular point, it's probably the red x. So we would assign this point to the red cluster. And so we could keep doing this. And so we could say maybe something like, looks like roughly the points that we have here, those points might be the points that are the closest to x, to the red x. Then for the green x, we have those points being the closest. And for the blue x, it looks like these points are the closest, right? So this point here, for example, that's kind of like a borderline case. It's pretty far away from this x. It's pretty far away from this x. I'm assuming here that it is closer to the blue x just for the purpose of illustration, right? And so this is our first step. And so now the next step is we update our centroids. So we take the mean of all of these points here. So let's suppose like I'm taking the mean of these 3 points here. And I calculate like what is the mean of these 3 points, and that is roughly in here, I would say. And so I'm moving my x to this position here. This isn't very pretty. So I'm moving my x to this position here. Okay. And then for the red one, it looks like, well, maybe the average, since there's 4 points over there, maybe the average moves a little bit into this direction here. And for the blue one, I have a lot of points down here, so maybe my x moves a little bit into this direction here. Okay, so this is kind of like my, after the first iteration, and now I'm gonna like restart all of this. I'm gonna take away these, and all that remains are the new centroids. And now I'm again assigning each point to its closest centroid. And so in this case, we actually have probably arrived at a good solution. So all of the points that are in here are closest to the green x. All of the points that are in here are closest to the red x. And all of the points that are over here are closest to the blue x. And so then in the final step, or in one other step, I would update my centroids again. So my blue one, my green one, and then my red one. And now after I kind of like remove those again, oops, that was too much. Now I would update again my cluster assignment, and I would maybe see that no point has changed, right? We still have all of the points are the same as they were before. And so that would be an indication that we have reached convergence, so that we have found the cluster. So no point was reassigned. They are all with the same cluster. The centroids are not updating. So we have reached convergence. We have reached a solution. So any questions about this?
Do you have to experiment? Sorry, do you have to experiment with your iterations, or does it actually have a condition in the program where it actually sees that no more updates are made, and then it basically terminates the program at that point?
Yeah, that's a great question. You can do both, right? There will be some kind of like terminal, like you can generally like well, there's the what does scikit-learn to do and what can you do in theory, right? You can definitely limit the number of iterations. That does make sense if you like in certain cases. You can you have these terminating criteria, right? That if no point is reassigned to a different cluster, then you simply end it. So you have to like, these are two reasonable conditions, and I'll talk more about some of those eventually. So this is like somewhat similar to k-nearest neighbor, because it's again kind of like the neighborhoods are really influencing what we are assigning here. And so here's kind of like an illustration that does exactly what I just explained. Okay, so a couple of things that we haven't really really discussed. So first, we need to figure out what is a good parameter k. And so some ideas we could kind of look at the data. If it's maybe low dimensional, we can eyeball it and say, it looks like there are 3 clusters in here, or there's 5 clusters in here, and pick k. The other thing we can do is we can compare the value of total intercluster difference for different values of k. So the distance from each point to its centroid, if we take the sum of all of those, maybe we can pick a k that minimizes this. But like I'll talk later a little bit about why absolutely minimizing this is a bad idea, because like what is the minimal value? Like if I have, let's say, n items in my data set, at which point would be the total intercluster distance be the lowest?
Just as many clusters as there are points.
Exactly. If I have as many clusters as there are points, then I simply have an absolute minimal intercluster distance of 0. And so we have to look at a little bit more detail of what is a good intercluster distance. And I'll talk about this later. And of course, you can try out many Ks and see that. The next thing we have to think about is, how do we pick our K starting points? That is actually very important in k-means, because if you pick bad Ks, then you can kind of like really get into trouble. And so here are some ideas. You could randomly pick them. You could try to pick points that are far apart, or you could manually pick them. And then as the question by Chad earlier, like convergence, how can we make sure that we actually terminate our algorithm? We have like no point has changed the cluster. That's kind of like a great rule. The distance between the old and the new centroid are below a certain threshold. So if the centroids aren't moving around much anymore, I could stop it, or I could have like a number of max iterations. And so here I want to kind of like show you this nice demo here for like how this works in practice. So let's suppose I have these 3 clusters here, and I can seed the points, and I'll do this, maybe here, and then I can run this and then update my centroids, and now we can reassign the points, and we have kind of like reached a good terminating condition. Okay, so now let's try to make it a little bit harder. Let's do this. And now, like you can see that all of these points here are assigned to the red one, and then we've updated it, and now I'm reassigning the points and I'm updating it, and it looks like I'm actually getting a good solution here. Okay. Let's restart it, and I'll pick again, and let's do this. And let's see what happens. Looks like we'll again have a good converging solution. Okay, now here is like a bit of a challenge. Now I have 4 points, right? And what's going to happen is that we will see that like clearly this isn't like a great solution. We have kind of like reached no, it's not completely stable yet. No, it's stable, but clearly that's not a great solution, right? So our k-means here has not worked so well. Now let's do this here. A human will probably like see, okay, there's 4 clusters here. We have the ring out here. We have the mouth of the smiley and the 2 eyes, right? But k-means will not be able to pick this up. So let's suppose we have these 4 clusters, and then if I run this, we can see that what k-means does, it doesn't take account of these particular features. And we'll like next time we'll learn about an algorithm that can like classify this perfectly, this kind of shape as well. So like what this shows us is like the property, right, of how we move the centroids simply doesn't work for like a structure like this. And so yeah, you can play around with this tool. There's like you can kind of like play with different like initialization strategies. And so if I have this method of picking the farthest point, then we have like a great initialization, and we can converge very quickly on this. Okay, so in terms of computational complexity, this is like a very fast algorithm. Like we have like a big O of n times k times d times I, where n is the number of items, k is the number of clusters, d is the number of dimensions or the feature of the feature vectors, and I is the number of iterations needed until convergence. And so these are of course like well known, of course, and I isn't kind of like, you can't really predict I ahead of time. So I is kind of the tricky part here, but for data that does have well-defined clusters, I is typically very small. And so in practice, k-means is very fast. And the other thing that you should note is that Lloyd's algorithm is an approximation algorithm. It will find like a local optimum, but it will not necessarily find a global optimum. But since the algorithm is so fast, it is very common to run the algorithm multiple times and pick the solution with the smallest total intra-cluster distance. So if I picked my k and I'm confident that my k is correct, I would still run k means like 5 or 10 times and pick the ones with the lowest intra-cluster distance. And some other properties is that total intra-cluster distance decreases at every iterations of Lloyd's algorithms. And the total intercluster distance, of course, decreases with larger k up to where k equals to n. Okay, so let's look at this in scikit-learn. Scikit-learn has a nice implementation of the k-means method, and we will create our like a simple data set here to look at this. So we have our 3 blobs here. And these 3 blobs, I've simply created them based on some kind of like this make blobs function that uses some Gaussian kernel. And we have specified that we want 3 centers and 500 samples. Okay, now we run the scikit-learn k-means implementation with these parameters here. We have like the number of clusters, the number of initializations, whether we want like random or some better method, we'll start with random. And then we specify our maximum number of iterations as our terminating condition. And just for the fun of it, we'll start with like a single one so that we see the random the assignment. And so if we do that, we can now see that, by the way, this works very much like our classification problem, right? We have like we run the algorithm, or we specify the algorithm with these parameters, and then we run .fit predict and do that on our data set X, and we get out our Y predict data set, so that our Y predict vector. This is like very much like what we saw in classification problems. And here we are plotting this, and this is like only after like a single iteration, right? So the k-means hasn't really had time to run Lloyd's algorithm here, and we see that like maybe this isn't a great clustering, but this is kind of like how it was initialized. So here we just have a random initialization and assign the closest points. If we run this a couple of times, we can see that the boundaries change. So you can see here now, this looks actually fairly good. We were lucky with a cluster assignment. If we do this more and more often, we see that these, like, because we have a random initial assignment, the points here change. If we set the maximum number of iterations to 5, we already see an improvement. So, well, this was actually bad luck. We'll run this a couple of times. And yeah, so it's not completely reliable. Correct. Let's try to increase this to 20, and then we should not be seeing any kind of like spurious assignments. Okay. Then there's a couple of more arguments for the algorithm that you could use. Is the n-init, the number of times the k-means algorithm will be run with different centroid seeds. And then this automatically basically runs this multiple times. And it will be the best output of n-init consecutive runs in terms of the total intercluster distance. And if you don't specify it, this does it actually do it 10 times. And then for the init, we had the random picks here. That's kind of like the simplest version. By default, the algorithm actually uses the k-means plus algorithm, which is kind of like designed to, like, it's Lloyd's algorithm, but the only difference is that it spreads out the initial seeds. So what it does is it picks the first center is chosen uniformly at a random from the data points that are being clustered, and each subsequent cluster center is chosen from the remaining data points with a probability proportional to its square distance from the point's closest existing cluster center. So what this means is like you pick one point, like you pick a point from your data set as your initial centroid, and then you pick every other point, every other centroid, such that it has like a high probability of being very distant. And so if we do this for a simple data set with k-means plus initialization and 10 runs, we get really good results, and even like a single run here yields good results already. But of course, these are like the perfect example of clustering, right? So it's easy to get this right. Now let's look at some more complicated data sets. So like what happens with like we make some certain assumptions about our data. We make an assumption that our data here is convex, so that we essentially have like if we were to draw a boundary across our cluster, we would assume this to be a convex shape, and we assume it to be isotropic, so uniform in all orientations. And so up to now, we've applied this algorithm only to nice Gaussian blobs of equal size. But let's see what this algorithm does for points that vary in density and size, vary in variance, are anisotropic, and are non-convex. Okay, so here is one example where the blobs are kind of like about the same size in terms of their spread, but have very different kind of like number of points. And we can see that that actually works fairly robustly, right? So the number of items doesn't matter all that much, but what matters, we'll see is that if we try to spread out the blobs a little bit more. So now we have like here one big cluster, like a human would easily pick this out as a cluster, right? And then we have two very dense clusters. And that is much more problematic because the way our distances work, right? We're assuming here Euclidean distances, and we see that these points here that you would argue belong to this big, more kind of spread out cluster are assigned to the smaller, denser clusters because we have no notion about that you should use a different distance metric for this cluster than for this cluster. So we're using the same distance metric for all of these clusters. And so we have these like misassignments. So if you have blobs that are or like clusters that are not uniform in terms of how spread out they are, k-means can be problematic. If we have anisotropic point clouds like this that are squeezed, k-means for the same reasons simply doesn't perform well, right? So like as a human, we could probably spot like this here is a cluster. You could consider this as a cluster and this is a separate cluster, or one big cluster here and this is a cluster. But k-means doesn't understand that. So it doesn't do well because, again, of the limitations of the distance, which kind of like works in all directions. And for like non-convex point clouds, like our moons, we have exactly the same problem. We have like the centroid somewhere around here, the centroid are somewhere around here. It doesn't take account that these are like shapes that are not following this Gaussian blob model. Okay, before I go into choosing k, I'll take our 5-minute break now, and I'll see you all again at 1:06. Okay, so now let's look at how can we actually choose k if we don't know it ahead of time. As I said, k-means is very sensitive to the choice of parameter k. So here's what happens if we were to underestimate the number of k. So you would clearly get problematic results. Similarly, overestimation is equally problematic. So here we have 5 blobs, and we like assign 7 clusters, and we can see that like clearly this isn't a good clustering result. So we talked a little bit about how can we choose k. Of course, visual comparison, if it's possible, like this is a great way. And then like now I want to look at these two methods here, looking at which k the total intra-cluster distance tapers off, and then silhouette analysis. And so let's start with the first one. What we do here is like I'm trying out a different range of k's, k1 to 10, and then I'm running k-means with the k. I am trying to like fit it. I get my labels back, and then I calculate the score, like the intra-cluster distance here, and I'm kind of storing this in a scores array. I'm plotting the results of each of these iterations with different k's, and then I'm plotting the scores. And so what this results in is this here. So you see like the data clustered with 1 to 10 clusters. And we can see that k5 results in a good result here. And this is the interesting part. This is the total intra-cluster distance. And we see that initially the intra-cluster distance is very high. If we increase it to kind of like the case 2, we can see that the intra-cluster distance drops a lot. And then if we increase it to 3, it drops again. And then if we increase it to 4, it drops again. And to 5, it drops again. But then it keeps getting lower. But we have kind of like this discontinuity here, this kind of knee. And so basically here the intra-cluster distance tapers off. So it's still of course decreasing, but it's not decreasing as fast as it did before. And that's kind of because like now we can kind of see that it doesn't matter all that much if I have like for k6 here my total intra-cluster distance, just by having those two like centroids somewhere here and somewhere here, it's not going to make the total number, like the total intra-cluster distance, it's not going to change it as rapidly, right? As compared to when I still have more clusters to discover. And so if you want to pick k in a data set that you can't visualize as easily as this, you would use a method like that and plot the total intra-cluster distance, and then pick a k where the decrease levels off. And that is then usually like the right k. So any questions about this? Does it make sense? That's going to be like homework 8. So it's definitely useful to understand that. Okay, if not, then let's move on to the silhouette analysis. Silhouette analysis is another good method for choosing k and k-means. And here, for each point in the data set, we compare the distance between points in the same cluster and points in neighboring clustering using the silhouette score. And the silhouette score is a measure of how similar an item is to its own cluster and how different it is from other clusters. So it's not just a measure of how good it fits, but it's also how good it would fit or how different it is from another cluster. And we can compute the silhouette score such that we take each data element I and cluster L, and we calculate the distance of I and L. And then we interpret the distance of I and L as the dissimilarity of I with the items in cluster L. And so if our distance between I and L is small, then I is very similar to the items in the cluster. If it is large, then I is very different from the items in the cluster. And for each data element I, we define the mean intra-cluster distance as AI of the distance between I and Li, where Li denotes the cluster that contains the element I. So AI measures how well an element I is assigned to its own cluster. Here, a small number is better. And then for each element, we define a second term BI, which means the nearest cluster distance. So that is the distance where we only consider clusters that are not that don't contain that particular item. So here we have the distance to the cluster where that element is contained. Here we have the distance to the nearest cluster that does not contain the element, okay? And the silhouette coefficient for a data element I is then given by BI minus AOI divided by the max of AI and BI. And this has a range of -1 to 1, with 1 being good. And why is that? And what would the negative value here mean? Any ideas?
Clusters overlap.
What do you mean dispersion?
Overlap or dispersion? Possibly, I guess, but I'm looking for some simpler, like more intuitive explanation.
If A is larger than B, then you'd get a negative value, which means
Exactly. And what happens if A is larger than B? Like what does that mean in terms of clustering? So it means that according to this score, I actually assigned my point to the wrong cluster, right? So that score would say this cluster, like the cluster it's assigned to, is actually a worse fit than the other nearest cluster. That's kind of like the intuition behind having like a negative silhouette coefficient. And then the silhouette score is the mean silhouette coefficient of all of the samples here. And we can do that with like this nice plot called the silhouette plot, which shows the silhouette coefficient for each sample. And so I'm not going to go through that. This is just a lot of code that does mostly plotting and a little bit of clustering. But if we run this, and we do this for these 5 Gaussian blobs here, and tried it out with a couple of different clusters, the red line here is our overall silhouette score, and then we have for each items we have the silhouette coefficients, right? And so you can see that for some items here the silhouette coefficient is actually like slightly negative, but for many items it's positive, but it is not necessarily uniformly great, right? And then we can compare that overall silhouette score and the individual silhouette coefficients across different configurations. And so we can see that like compared to like the K is 2 example, our silhouette score has increased. But we can see that cluster 1, like the coefficients are not particularly high. If we look at for clusters 4, we can see that it looks like we have actually fairly stable clusters 3, 2, and 0 here. But our cluster 1, and that kind of like makes sense if we look at this figure here, our cluster 1 isn't very good. And then if we have clusters of with 5, we actually get like a high overall silhouette score, like the red line here. And we also get very high silhouette coefficients for the individual items. And so this looks like a great solution, right? So this is like the highest silhouette score we've seen. And we also have like no weird behavior with our individual silhouette coefficients here. And then if we have like too many, we can see that like because we have like both the term to the nearest like to the assigned cluster and the nearest non-assigned cluster, the score actually drops if we increase the number of clusters beyond what is reasonable. And so here we can again spot exactly the 4 clusters that are still well assigned and this 1 cluster that doesn't work. And of course, I just want to say this again, if you can see this in 2 dimensions, like we do here in these examples, you don't really need that, right? But if you have 100 dimensions, then of course you need something like this to evaluate your clustering, because you just simply can't plot a 100-dimensional data set all that easily. So any questions about the silhouette analysis here? Okay, so then let's take a look at a real life example and not a constructed example with our famous IRIS dataset. So let's see how well it does. Just recall, IRIS dataset are these plant species, and we measure these four length and width of the sepal leaves and the petal leaves. And we saw before that this is not like an easily distinguishable data set in this case here, the blue and the orange dimension. But we'll see how well we can actually separate this with clustering. We'll also come back to this data set when we do another unsupervised method, principal component analysis. But let's look at let's run a clustering algorithm using all features and plot the results again in those 2 dimensions. And so if we run this here with 3 clusters, we can compare those 2. Let me zoom out a little bit so we can see them next to each other. We can compare those 2, and we can see that, well, seems like we have gotten the red one here right, which isn't all that surprising, but the blue one here seems to be a little bit less so. The green, the yellow, here you see kind of an artifact, of course, of this. I'm only looking at 2 dimensions. This point here in high dimensional space, it is actually closer to the other orange points, but in this particular combination of dimensions that I picked here, it is not. So if you're looking at higher dimensional data, this is of course what you would expect, something like that. So we can see that, well, it's not all that great. And it looks similar to the ground truth labels, but there's some mistakes. And of course, how could we evaluate the quality of the cluster? Now we could evaluate this again with the silhouette scores. But we can also try to simply, because this is a labeled data set and we actually have ground truth, we could try to compare our labels. And so you can do that, but it is slightly tricky to do that. And so because we have this information here and we have those labels, we can actually do this. We can calculate some scores again. And that is quite useful if you have labels. So here, you have the homogeneity score, which is a homogeneity metric of a cluster labeling given a ground truth. Here, a clustering result satisfies homogeneity if all of its clusters contain only data points which are members of a single class. Then completeness score is a clustering result satisfies completeness if all the data points that are members of a given class are elements of the same cluster. And then the V measure score is the harmonic mean between the 2 of them. And then I have this function that is quite useful in scikit-learn that simply plots all 3 of them. And the interesting bit here is that this works independent of the actual labels. So here just the order matters, right? So I'm running this for 0, 0, 1, 1, and then 1, 1, 2, 2. And so since the identity of the labels is not what we care about, because in clustering, we don't make a prediction about which label. We just say this is one cluster, this is another cluster. We only want to look at the groups, right? The zeros together, and which is the group that is most similar in an alternative or in the labeled data set. And so here we have the 1s match the zeros, the 2s match the 1s. And then here we would have an example where we have a not perfect clustering result, where we have, let's say, this is our ground truth here. And then we have our clustering result, we have misclassified 1. And we can look at this. And we can see, of course, the homogeneity score for the first one here is perfect, and for the second one, it's actually fairly low because we have so few samples. And if we do this, if we compute both homogeneity, completeness score, and the V measure all together, we can see that we have the 75 or 0.75 scores here, which means we have approximately 76% correct, which is okay, but not great. Okay, so for the rest of the lecture, I have an activity where we're going to look at a clustering problem for Gentoo penguins. But before we go into that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Could you go over silhouette analysis again, real quick?
The silhouette analysis?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, so intuitively, what you do is you calculate for every item, you calculate two scores, right? How well does it fit to its own cluster, and how well does it fit to another cluster? And then you create a combined score, like this term here. You create a combined score that is high if it fits well to the cluster that you selected, but does not fit well to any other cluster. So that's the silhouette coefficient for an individual item. That gives you the metric of, is this cluster very good for this item, but not very, is this item very good for this cluster, but not very good for any other cluster? And then the silhouette score is just the mean of all of the silhouette coefficients of all of the samples. So you calculate this silhouette coefficient for every data element, and then you take the mean of it. And the higher silhouette score, the better your clustering, usually. And that's what we see here in these plots, right? So we see that like the red dashed line here is our overall silhouette score, and the individual bars here are our silhouette coefficients. And we see that some of these silhouette coefficients are very low, and some of them are even negative, which means that according to that score, we have misclassified an item. And then we can see that the score rises and is the highest when we have the right number of clusters that we know in this example, and then we have overall also fairly high silhouette coefficients. You can see that some of the points don't have that great of a silhouette coefficients. These are also the points that are like on the margins here. So like this point here, for example, like it's gonna fit with the yellow one or the orange cluster better, but it is not that far from the black point, right? So that's why the silhouette coefficient for this point here will actually not be that high. Any other questions?
Yeah, I was going to ask about the k-means graph, the one where you showed the knee.
Yeah.
And you said that we might see that on our homework. Like if I was to automate that, I would actually probably look at the change in slope, and you know, when the change in slope went below a certain value, I would call that good. Is that acceptable, or is there some other method where you would determine, you know, what the optimal number is?
That's a good question. I don't think you can like automatically, like you can probably find that point like algorithmically, right? Like where does that slope taper off? So that would be reasonable. I think that you have to be a little bit careful because you can't work with like static numbers, right? Because it's going to depend on your data set. But I'm sure if you think about it, and I haven't, but you can definitely find an algorithm that picks the K here. Though like this is of course like a clean example, right? I've picked these very distinct clusters, and I see this very nicely here. In reality, it might not be quite as nice if you look at some more complicated data sets. So in your homework, we don't ask you to automate that. We just ask you to essentially do this kind of analysis and then like analyze yourself what K is. And the other reason here is you could do that, but it often isn't all that like, well, it's not a big deal to spend a little bit of time to pick your K. Because this is usually for some kind of like analysis in the first place where you really want to look at your data and want to reason about it, right? It's not like you could do like a movie recommendation kind of thing where you have a product where you don't do data analysis. these unsupervised methods are frequently for like doing data analysis, and you want to understand your data. And so doing a plot like this to pick a K and then visualizing it and analyzing it is often part of the process here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. So the exercise here is just like taking this penguins data set, and like since like we did for the irises, we want to classify the species of the penguins here. And I've set it up for you so that you have a clean data set. I'm plotting it. And the goal is to like cluster this data set with k-means, and then do like evaluate the scores, like the homogeneity, the v-measure score, and the completeness score, and kind of like think about whether this is a good clustering, whether k-means gives good results for that. I'll set up the breakout groups.
I have a question. If you have high dimensional data and it forms nice clusters, if you print any two of those dimensions, can you usually see the clusters?
Sometimes. What you would do there is that you would hope that if you do dimensionality reduction first, that you would see nice clusters. So that the dimensionality reduction also picks up on this. And then if you show a PCA or an MDS or like any other dimensional reduction plot, then you should see them. Sometimes it depends, right? Like you can't say that if you pick 2 dimensions out of a high dimensional data set that you might see might see the clusters. Maybe the 2 dimensions are outliers, right? So in general, you can't say that. But if you plot all of the dimensions, like for example, in a parallel coordinates plot, you should be able to spot the clusters. Otherwise, like your clustering isn't going to be all that stable or great or useful.
So 2 of the dimensions should show the clusters if it forms good clusters.
Can you say that again? I couldn't hear you.
2 of the dimensions should be visible as clusters if the data does form into clusters.
Some 2 possibly, yeah, but I don't want to. Generally, I would say that is likely, but it might not be the whole story, right?
Okay.
Okay, great. So I'll set up the breakout rooms. Thanks, everyone.